Hey friend, welcome to True Crime Whispers Before Sleep. I'm really glad you're here. If you enjoy true crime stories told in a calm and relaxing way, you'll feel right at home. Before you get too cozy, tap that like button and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next chilling case. And if you feel like it, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now take a deep breath, get comfortable, and let's get into tonight's story. Woodside Lane, December 3rd, 1989. It was the kind of cold that carried the scent of pine and chimney smoke. The air felt festive, like it had been wrapped in ribbons and quiet joy. In the heart of Lorton, Virginia, nestled just off the Richmond Highway, the Woodside apartment complex was alive with tradition. That Sunday night, the air buzzed with holiday cheer. Lights blinked from balcony railings, garlands draped staircases, and laughter filtered out from windows carried on the breeze. Residents gathered in the clubhouse at the front of the complex for the annual Yuletide festival. It had become more than just a holiday event. It was a community ritual. Parents sipped hot cocoa, children played games and whispered excitedly about Santa. The evening promised a safe, familiar warmth, the kind of comfort that makes people lower their guard. Tammy Brannon was among the crowd that night. 27 years old, she had the look of someone who bore life with quiet strength. She worked tirelessly to give her daughter everything. Working weekdays as an accountant and weekends at a jewelry store, it was the life of a single mother. Not easy, but laced with purpose. And everything she did for Melissa. Melissa Brannon was 5 years old, tiny at just 3 feet tall, 38 pounds, with warm brown hair and curious blue eyes. That night, she wore her favorite outfit, a navy blue sweater adorned with Big Bird in the corner, paired with a matching red and blue plaid skirt, red stockings, and shiny black shoes with a gold buckle, a festive ensemble for a festive evening. Her mother said she looked adorable, and she did. Originally, Tammy wasn't sure she had the energy to go. After a long week of work, exhaustion had settled into her bones. She gently told Melissa that maybe they would stay in and rest, spend the evening curled up at home. But the disappointment in Melissa's face was immediate, her blue eyes wide, her tiny voice pleading. Tammy couldn't resist. They arrived at the clubhouse between 7:15 and 7:30 p.m. Though Melissa had been eager to attend, once inside the crowded clubhouse, she clung tightly to her mother's side. Shyness wrapped around her like a winter coat. Tammy sat with familiar residents, and Melissa nestled against her lap, eyes scanning the unfamiliar faces. There were around 115 people present at the height of the event. Parents, children, neighbors. The atmosphere was alive with chatter and music. Kids ran in circles, laughing near a payphone tucked into a hallway that connected the main room to the restrooms and utility areas. Melissa remained still for most of the night, occasionally smiling, but always tethered to her mother. Eventually, warmth crept into her comfort zone. She saw 2 young boys she recognized, children she had played with before. And soon her shyness melted. With permission from Tammy, she joined the boys, giggling and darting between people. Tammy kept her eyes on her daughter, who never strayed far. Even when Melissa needed to use the bathroom, she asked first, and Tammy, along with the boys' mother, escorted them down the hallway. That was Melissa. Quiet, respectful, always careful. Tammy noticed a man watching her. She didn't recognize him. When she asked someone about him, they said he was a maintenance worker, one of the men who took care of the property. He later approached her table and sat nearby. He was tall, 23 years old, unshaven with a weary look about him. Caleb Hughes, though she didn't know his name yet. He spoke to Melissa, asked how old she was, said she was pretty. Tammy felt a chill then, not from the December air, but from something deeper. The comment stuck with her. It felt wrong. Melissa returned to the table at one point to ask for a brownie. The man offered to get her something sweet and returned with a cupcake. For 30 minutes he sat at their table. Too long, too close, too familiar. Melissa didn't seem bothered. She had seen her mother speaking with him, and that was enough to quiet any suspicion a child might feel. Trust transfers like that. Tammy noticed the man's attention lingered every time Melissa returned to ask permission to play or do something new. He never ignored her presence. He always engaged. Tammy felt something wasn't right. At one point, as Tammy and the boy's mother took the children down the hallway again, Hughes appeared, stepping out of the men's bathroom. He offered to escort the boys, to give the mothers a break. Both women declined. They shared a look. That strange, unspoken understanding between parents when something doesn't sit right. The hours passed. Melissa's bedtime usually came around 8:30, but it was the holidays. There was music, there was laughter, and Santa was present. A little bending of bedtime seemed fair. At around 10 p.m., Melissa returned to her mother and asked, "Can I take some potato chips home?" Tammy smiled. "Just a few." She watched her daughter walk to the table where the chips sat, green plate in hand. She moved across the room, slow and sweet, pausing by the table and scooping up a handful of chips and dip. Tammy remembered looking away, only for a moment, to stamp out her cigarette, to say goodnight to a small group of residents. She reached for her fur coat, slid her arms through the sleeves, turned around. Melissa was gone, just like that. Gone. Panic doesn't always hit like a wave. Sometimes it creeps in slowly, but not this time. Tammy knew instantly. Her eyes scanned the room. Her voice rose. "Melissa? Melissa, where are you?" She searched the entire room, twice, then again. Parents stopped talking. A silence cut through the joy. People stood up. Children were asked. Adults joined the search. Every corner of the clubhouse was checked. Melissa's name rang out over and over. No one had seen her leave. She hadn't been near the front door. She hadn't called out. There had been no scream. A manager called the police. The clubhouse was still decorated with tinsel and lights. Santa stood motionless, and outside, the cold deepened. When the police arrived, they took quick statements. Officers began canvassing immediately. Time was everything. A detective soon joined the scene. Tammy pushed through rooms, through panic, checking bathrooms, knocking on doors. She reached one labeled private, the utility room. She didn't hesitate. She opened it. What she saw made her legs weaken. A long window, open. Blinds pulled up, fluttering in the wind. The chill cutting through the space. And that window was low. So low a man could step right through it carrying a child. Tammy knew. This wasn't a child who wandered off. This was an abduction, and it happened under the soft glow of Christmas lights, within feet of neighbors and laughter. She had turned away for just a moment, and Melissa was gone. Cold wind rushed through the clubhouse utility room. It lifted the blinds like a silent witness, fluttering them in jagged bursts. Tammy stood frozen at the threshold, staring at the open window. It wasn't just the breeze that chilled her. It was the sudden vacuum of her daughter's presence. The space that Melissa had occupied mere moments ago, now eerily empty. The window was full length, low to the ground. An adult wouldn't need to crouch to pass through it. Just one clean step and they'd be outside, swallowed by darkness. The blinds rattled like an alarm no one had heard. That was the exit. That was how someone had taken her baby. Tammy's voice cracked as she called again, louder this time. "Melissa!" Her footsteps echoed in the hallway as she retraced her steps, looking into the women's bathroom, the men's bathroom, calling again, hoping, praying that Melissa had somehow wandered out of sight, that maybe she was hiding behind a coat rack or curled under a table. But in her heart, she already knew. Melissa wasn't hiding. and someone had taken her. The police presence grew quickly. More patrol cars arrived, sirens off, lights flashing against the red brick of the clubhouse. Flashlights cut through the darkened trees behind the complex. Officers moved quickly, asking questions, organizing search grids, cordoning off the utility room. A detective approached Tammy with a calm but serious expression, gently asking her to describe what had happened. Tammy's words tumbled out in fragments, her voice trembling, her eyes wide, her hands clenched into the sleeves of her rabbit fur coat. She tried to walk the detective through the night, through the way Melissa had played, how she had kept checking in, how she had asked permission to take some chips home, how Tammy had seen her walking toward the table, and how the next moment, she was gone. Other residents, those still lingering in the clubhouse, stepped in to help. They fanned out around the building and beyond, searching the perimeter, checking the parking lots, the hallways, behind bushes and near staircases. Parents gathered their own children close, asking them urgently, "Did you see Melissa? Do you know where she went?" No one had seen anything. It made no sense. 115 people had been at the party. By 10 p.m., the crowd had thinned. Sunday night, after all. People had work the next morning. Still, enough people had been around that someone should have noticed something. A little girl in red stockings and black shoes doesn't just vanish in a room full of neighbors, unless someone planned it. That possibility settled on the detective like a shadow. Melissa wouldn't have opened that window herself. It was too tall, too stiff. She wouldn't have wandered out of the building into the night alone. She wouldn't have disobeyed her mother. She wasn't the kind of child to sneak away, and most of all, she had been holding a plate of chips. She had been coming back to say she was ready to leave. Instead, she had disappeared without a sound. Outside the clubhouse, a fence lined the property. Officers discovered that a section of the top rail had been recently cracked. Footprints, large, adult-sized, led from the open window across the grass to that fence. On the other side of it, the footprints continued toward an empty lot where an old, abandoned restaurant stood in silence. That wasn't coincidence. The man who took her had known that lot was there. He had known the layout of the complex. He had known that the window in the utility room would be an easy, unmonitored escape route. Inside the clubhouse, the questioning continued. The detective asked every remaining guest if they had seen anything. Anyone acting strangely, anyone leaving early, anyone standing too close to the children. One name came up again and again. Caleb Hughes, one of the apartment's maintenance men, 23 years old. A man who had been drinking heavily at the party. A man who had offered to escort other people's children to the bathroom. A man who had sat at Tammy and Melissa's table for 30 minutes, uninvited, asking Tammy personal questions and commenting on Melissa's appearance. He had been there, but now he was nowhere to be found. Tammy confirmed it. She remembered him clearly. She'd noticed his gaze lingering too long. He had asked whether Melissa was her only child and how old she was. He had even gone to get her a cupcake. Tammy hadn't seen him after that moment when Melissa asked for chips. When she turned around and realized her daughter was gone, he was gone too. The managers called Hughes's apartment. No answer. They called again. Eventually, his wife picked up the phone. She sounded confused. She said he wasn't home. It had been well over an hour since he left the clubhouse, long enough to drive home several times over. But his car, a maroon Honda, was nowhere in sight. Something was wrong. The police knew it. The detective's instincts were sounding alarms. Caleb Hughes had the means. He had the access, and he had vanished. By midnight, military personnel from nearby Fort Belvoir had joined the search. The apartment complex backed up into woods. On either side, patches of thick trees and brush stretched out into the darkness. Officers pushed through with flashlights, combing every inch. They called out Melissa's name over and over, hoping for an answer. None came. Tammy was asked to return to her apartment to answer more questions. The detective sat with her gently, trying to gather a clear picture of her life. Did she have problems with anyone? Any coworkers? Neighbors? Had anyone shown interest in her or her daughter? Tammy shook her head. Her life was quiet. She worked hard. Her ex-husband lived in Texas. They were on good terms. Her parents were supportive. No one had ever threatened her. No one had ever made her feel unsafe. Until that night. Until Caleb Hughes. She tried to breathe, to stay calm, but the fear was a living thing now. It clung to her chest. Every time the phone rang, every time the door creaked, she looked for Melissa. But the chair at the table was empty, the toys on the floor untouched, the small pink jacket still hanging by the door. The detective looked at her solemn. He didn't say it, but she knew. Melissa hadn't wandered off. Melissa had been taken, and the man who took her had vanished into the cold December night. By the early hours of December 4th, the festive lights around the Woodside apartments felt like cruel reminders of what had been lost. The quiet decorations blinked in the dark like unanswered questions. The clubhouse, once filled with laughter and the scent of hot cocoa, was now a crime scene, taped off and sterile, its warmth stolen by fear. Inside, officers moved carefully, documenting everything. The open utility room window was photographed, its blinds lifted and waving faintly, as if still calling out for help. Outside, footprints led from that window to the broken top rail of a fence, and then onward toward the back lot, where an old, unused restaurant stood like a shadow watching the complex. The detectives knew this wasn't a random exit. Whoever had taken Melissa had planned it. The escape route wasn't obvious unless you'd studied the layout. You had to know that the window in the utility room was rarely locked. You had to know it opened into an isolated part of the complex. And you had to know that the abandoned lot was just beyond the trees. There was one man who knew all of those things. Caleb Hughes. He wasn't just at the party. He worked for the complex. He had access to that utility room. He had reason to know every hallway, every locked door, every blind spot. And according to multiple witnesses, he had been acting strangely the entire night. Residents had seen him drinking heavily, drunker than someone working maintenance should have been at a family Christmas party. A woman remembered him saying he planned to get real drunk. Another said he'd made an inappropriate comment to one of the female managers, offering to run an errand for her only if she came with him. She brushed it off, but the remark had made her uncomfortable. There were other stories too. A man at the bar remembered Hughes saying there were a lot of nice-looking women here tonight, but that he wouldn't go to bed with any of them. Another woman recalled Hughes asking her to dance, an odd thing for a maintenance man to do at a family party. She had declined. Something about his demeanor was off. Parents noticed Hughes playing with the children more than the other adults. He wasn't just standing nearby or chatting. He was actively involved in their games, lingering near them, watching. At one point, he reportedly placed Melissa on his lap, though Tammy hadn't seen that herself, but others had. And now, Melissa was gone. The managers tried calling Hughes again. No answer. When his wife finally picked up, she said she didn't know where he was. He hadn't come home. That, more than anything, was the red flag. Hughes lived only 4 miles away from the clubhouse, a 10-minute drive at most. But over an hour had passed. Where was he? What had he done with those missing minutes? Officers were dispatched to his residence. When they arrived, his maroon Honda was still gone. It was nearly 1 a.m. before Caleb Hughes finally called the clubhouse. The police were waiting. The officer who answered kept his tone steady, casual. Hughes sounded angry. He was upset that the police had called his house multiple times. He complained that his wife had children and needed sleep. He asked why they were calling him at all. That was when the officer told him. A little girl was missing. A child from the party, Melissa Brannon, had disappeared. She had last been seen holding a plate of chips, and she hadn't been seen since. The officer described Melissa, her age, her outfit, her size. He asked Hughes if he remembered her. Hughes said no. He claimed he didn't know any child by that name. He said he hadn't spoken to any children that night. He said he hadn't noticed anything unusual. But the officer knew he was lying. Multiple witnesses placed Hughes at Tammy's table. They recalled his questions about Melissa. They remembered the cupcake. They remembered him talking to her repeatedly. They remembered him being there when she returned to ask permission to play. When pressed about his whereabouts, Hughes said he left the party around 10:10 p.m. He said he took the long way home. He didn't stop anywhere, just drove slowly. That was his story. But the officer did the math. The drive from the clubhouse to Hughes's home was just under 4 miles. Even taking the scenic route, it wouldn't have taken more than 20 minutes. So why did it take him nearly 2.5 hours? That was when Hughes admitted he'd stopped. He said he went to a convenience store, bought more beer, but he couldn't say where. He didn't have a receipt, didn't remember the name of the store, didn't remember the road he was on, didn't remember what time he got home. Just vague memories and alcohol-blurred excuses. The detective asked about the route again. Hughes described a path that stretched the drive to just under 10 miles, 9.7 to be exact. But even that wouldn't account for the missing time. You still would have gotten home an hour ago, the detective pointed out. No response, and the story kept shifting. Back at Hughes's house, officers requested the clothes he had worn that night. He agreed, saying they were in the basement. But when they entered the laundry area, they found the clothes not sitting in a hamper or folded neatly on a chair, but tumbling inside the dryer. A gray jacket, a polo shirt, a pair of jeans, socks, and sneakers. His work boots were on his feet, but inside the dryer were the sneakers, white Nikes with signs of tampering, deep gouges along the sides, clean cuts through the rubber soles, as if someone had sliced away part of the shoe, removing something. The cuts were fresh. The white inside the sole was stark and bright, untouched by dirt or wear. The officer stared. "You wash your shoes too?" he asked. Hughes shrugged. "I always do that." But Tammy had told them. He hadn't worked that night. He was dressed in work-style clothing, but he hadn't been doing maintenance duties. There was no reason for grease or stains. No reason to wash everything immediately after returning home. No reason, unless he was hiding something. Back at the station, a team of technicians examined the items. They ran luminol over the clothes and shoes. It glowed. Trace amounts of blood. On the sneakers. On the steering wheel of the car. On the brake pedal. On the floor mat beneath the driver's seat. Tiny amounts, but enough. Enough to raise every alarm the forensic team had. And so the search continued. Tammy provided Melissa's brush to collect hair samples. Her pajamas, too, for scent. Search dogs were deployed across the complex and beyond. Every patch of brush, every sidewalk, every ditch was combed by volunteers, military personnel, and police. They found nothing. No sign of Melissa, no sound, no cry, just an open window, a broken fence, and a trail that led to silence. The detective pressed harder. He asked Hughes to come in again. He agreed, but only if his wife could accompany him. They arrived together, quiet, subdued. The detective asked about the gouges in the shoes. Hughes said he didn't know what the officer meant. He asked about the timeline. Again, no real answers. Then came the question, did you abduct Melissa? Hughes didn't flinch. Prove it. That was his answer. Not denial, not shock, just arrogance. Prove it. They administered a polygraph. He failed. And yet there was still no body, no eyewitness, no surveillance. All they had was evidence, and every shred of it pointed to him. Morning broke cold and gray on December 4th. The light filtered weakly through low-hanging clouds, offering no warmth, only a harsher view of the reality that had set in overnight. At the Woodside Apartments, the air was still heavy with disbelief. No one had slept. Some stood outside with coffee cups clenched in numb hands. Others lingered near the police lines, hoping for news. Inside the station, the search had entered a new phase. Now it was about evidence, tangible proof, something to piece together the unthinkable. Tammy, still trembling from the shock of the night before, was asked to provide items that might carry her daughter's scent and DNA. She returned home and gathered Melissa's pajamas, the hairbrush she used every night, and a few other small things. It was an unbearable task, touching the things Melissa had worn just hours before, still warm with memory, but now used for a purpose no mother ever wants to imagine. Police took the brush and sent it to the lab. They used it to gather strands of Melissa's hair, to build a profile, to begin the long and painful process of identifying what could be found, on clothing, in the car, or out in the field. Back at Caleb Hughes's house, detectives had already taken possession of his vehicle, a maroon Honda, dirty, cluttered, and lined with dog hair and grime. In 1989, forensic testing wasn't what it is today. DNA testing was still in its infancy, but they had something powerful at their disposal, the tape lift method. Lab technicians began the grueling task of collecting fibers and hairs from every inch of Hughes's car using sticky tape. Long strips rolled carefully across the seats, the floor mats, the trunk. It was a slow, meticulous job. Each piece of tape was folded over itself, preserving every hair, every fiber, every fragment of evidence in a small, fragile sandwich. They searched the steering wheel, the gear shift, the seat cushions. They vacuumed and lifted. They cataloged and recorded. And then they saw it. Red fibers, blue fibers, yellow fibers, and strands of hair, blonde, brown, and something else, something coarser, darker. They paused. Red and blue, just like the plaid skirt Melissa had been wearing. Yellow, the same hue as Big Bird's cartoon feathers stitched into her sweater. They knew then that these weren't random threads. They were clues, clues that Melissa had been inside that car, but they needed confirmation. So they called Tammy again. They needed the exact outfit Melissa had worn. Tammy described it in detail. The navy sweater with Big Bird in the corner, the red and blue plaid elbow patches, the matching skirt, the red stockings, the small black shoes with the golden buckle, and the coat, her own coat. Black rabbit fur, a gift from her mother when she traveled to Germany. It had sentimental value, but now it was something else, a potential link. Lab techs had noticed unusual black hairs in Hughes's vehicle, and they wanted to test them against Tammy's coat. Tammy handed it over. Her hands shook as she let go of it, as though surrendering the coat was another part of surrendering Melissa. But she did it, for her daughter. The fibers and hairs from the car were now being sent to Quantico, to the FBI's most advanced forensic lab. If there was a match, they would find it there. Back at the station, Hughes sat for questioning again. The detective asked about the knife sheath found in the laundry basket, its blade missing. Hughes said it must have fallen out somewhere. Asked again about the gouges in his sneakers, sharp cuts to the soles that exposed clean, bright rubber. He shrugged. "I don't know what that is," he said. He claimed the cuts had always been there, but they hadn't. The shoes were worn down, scuffed and dirty from use, except in the places where chunks had been carved out. Those spots were clean, surgical. The detective leaned in. "You're telling me you came home at 12:30, showered and started laundry?" "Yeah," Hughes answered. "I always wash my clothes right away. They get dirty from work." "You didn't work that night?" Silence. The detective kept pushing. "Why wash your shoes? Why wash them right then?" And why wash them while your wife and children were asleep, when the sound of sneakers banging in the dryer would wake the entire household? He had no answer, no reason, nothing that made sense, and still, no confession. What Hughes didn't know was that his own wife was also raising red flags. She had grown suspicious. From the moment he came home, she said, things had felt off. She remembered the time clearly, 12:20 a.m., because she had looked at the clock in frustration when he walked through the door. She'd been dealing with repeated police calls, and now he showed up as if nothing had happened. He didn't mention the missing child, didn't explain where he'd been, didn't even seem curious. He just went to the shower, then to the laundry, then to the phone. She watched him, confused and angry. And then she checked the car, specifically the odometer. She knew how many miles he had driven before the party. She knew how many it should have been to get there and back, 4 miles each way. But the odometer told a different story. 51 additional miles, she told the police. And now they knew. Hughes hadn't just taken a long way home. He had taken a trip, a 25-mile journey somewhere, and back again, long enough to leave Melissa's small body somewhere it might never be found. The detective did the math. A 25-mile radius around the apartment complex. That was where he could have gone. That was where the search would expand. And the possibilities were overwhelming. Dense woods, industrial lots, rivers, especially the Potomac River, which flowed into the Chesapeake Bay, and eventually the Atlantic Ocean. If Hughes had gone there and thrown something into the water, they might never find her. But they wouldn't stop. Melissa deserved more than that. Tammy deserved more. The search radius expanded. Hundreds joined. Volunteers, officers, even Army privates from the nearby base. They moved through brush and briar, through streams and ditches. They turned over stones, cleared out culverts, looked in trash bins and storm drains. Every direction, every road, every foot of dirt within 25 miles was considered. But Melissa was not there. Or if she was, she had been hidden well. The evidence, however, kept speaking. At Quantico, scientists worked quietly and methodically. The red, blue, and yellow fibers from Hughes's car were analyzed under high-powered microscopes. Their chemical composition was compared against a sample outfit, an identical match of Melissa's Christmas outfit, tracked down by the FBI with help from JCPenney records and a compassionate family who had purchased the same set the year before. When the results came in, they were undeniable. The fibers matched, not just in color, but in chemical structure, thread twist, and manufacturing technique. Melissa had been in Hughes's passenger seat. So had the black rabbit fur from her mother's coat. And among the dog hair and dirt, a single brown hair. It was matched to Melissa's brush. It was her hair, her fibers, her presence, in Caleb Hughes's car. And still, he denied everything. He said nothing, but his silence was starting to collapse under the weight of the truth. Inside the FBI's forensic labs in Quantico, the air was cold and clinical. There was no room for opinion here, only facts, science, and unyielding patience. The technicians didn't know Melissa Brannon. They had never met her mother. But they worked with a sense of purpose, knowing that every hair and fiber they examined could be the missing piece. Their job wasn't to guess, it was to confirm. And what they found would become the backbone of the case. The red and blue fibers collected from the front passenger seat of Caleb Hughes's maroon Honda weren't just similar to Melissa's outfit. They were identical to a duplicate set of clothes sourced through an exhaustive search. The FBI had tracked down a family that had purchased the same JCPenney Christmas outfit Melissa wore, something that had only been manufactured once, a year prior. The agents asked for the outfit. The family agreed. That gesture, simple and kind, was now a lifeline. When the lab examined the two outfits side by side, the threads matched perfectly, down to the weave, down to the way the dye clung to the cotton, the blue fibers from the plaid skirt, the red patches from the sweater's elbows, the soft yellow fuzz from Big Bird's embroidery. All of it found inside Hughes's car. But that wasn't all. The black rabbit hairs collected from the passenger seat were also analyzed. They weren't just random black animal fur. They were specific, dyed rabbit fur with a chemical signature used in European garments. Tammy's coat. She had worn it that night. An elegant, warm coat passed down from her mother after a trip to Germany. It was one of a kind, and it shed easily, especially when Melissa hugged her, sat on her lap, leaned into her shoulder. Those black hairs had transferred from the coat to Melissa, and then from Melissa to the seat of Hughes's car. They hadn't just found Melissa's fibers, they had found Tammy's, layered together, undeniable. Still, the forensic team didn't stop there. They isolated the brown hair found among the fibers. It was longer than most, lighter than Hughes's, and different in texture from the dog hair. When compared against the hairs collected from Melissa's hairbrush, it matched. Not just the color or the texture, but the microscopic structure of the shaft and the root sheath. It was Melissa's. She had been in that passenger seat. She had been there. And Hughes was the only person who could have put her there. Back at the Fairfax County Police Department, detectives built their case meticulously. Everything had to be perfect. This wasn't a typical case. They didn't have a body. They didn't have a murder weapon. They didn't have a confession. What they had was circumstantial evidence, but it was layered and powerful, stacking higher with each passing day. Hughes's behavior hadn't helped him. He had lied to officers. He had destroyed or hidden evidence. He had washed his clothes, including his sneakers, within an hour of arriving home. And the sneakers were perhaps the most damning detail of all. White Nikes, cut, gouged, chunks missing from the soles, particularly around the edges where material could absorb fluids. The parts removed were the areas where blood might have soaked in. It wasn't accidental. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. The luminol testing had revealed trace amounts of blood in the car, on the floor mat, on the brake pedal, on the steering wheel, all on the driver's side, and the same was true for the sneakers. Even after the gouging, even after the wash, there were still tiny trace amounts of blood. It was a rare feat in forensic science, finding blood in a space that had been scrubbed, bleached, and deliberately cleaned. But the presence, no matter how small, was enough. Enough to suggest violence, enough to suggest panic, enough to suggest a child had bled in that vehicle. Hughes, however, offered no explanations. Each time he was questioned, his answers became more guarded. He didn't know Melissa. He didn't remember speaking to her. He didn't recall where he had gone after the party, but the odometer in his car said otherwise. 51 miles had been added between the time he left the clubhouse and the time he returned home. A drive that should have taken 10 minutes had taken over 2.5 hours. His wife confirmed it. She had looked at the clock. She remembered the time. She remembered the noise, the sound of sneakers banging in the dryer. She remembered the strangeness of it all, the way he showered before even mentioning that a child had gone missing, the way he insisted on washing every item of clothing, including the shoes, before returning the police's call. She hadn't suspected murder, but she had suspected lies, and she told the detectives everything. That confession, quiet and reluctant, pushed the investigation further. With a 25-mile radius established, law enforcement launched a massive search. More than 500 volunteers and trained personnel scoured the woods, the roads, the parking lots, the waterways. They searched every drainage pipe, every dumpster, every stretch of forest floor. And still, they found nothing. Tammy tried to stay hopeful. She refused to remove the presents from under the Christmas tree. She kept Melissa's favorite toys in their usual spots. She left her daughter's name on the mailbox. She kept the phone number unchanged, just in case Melissa, wherever she might be, found a way to call. Days passed, then weeks, then a month. By January, the decorations had long been taken down, but in Tammy's apartment, the tree remained. a silent, sparkling monument to the child who should have been opening her gifts. She stopped working, stopped sleeping. She lived suspended in grief, frozen in time. But the case was still moving. In the background, quietly, slowly, it was building, until it reached a breaking point. 1 year after Melissa's disappearance, a Fairfax County grand jury indicted Caleb Hughes, not for murder, but for abduction with intent to defile, the strongest charge they could file without a body. And the prosecution believed it was enough. They had the evidence, they had the timeline, they had the lies, they had the fibers, the hairs, the blood, they had the footprints outside the window, they had the broken fence, and they had the one thing Hughes had never been able to offer: an explanation. So they prepared for trial. Tammy braced herself, and a quiet community held its breath, hoping that justice, long delayed, would finally be delivered. February 1991. Nearly 2 years had passed since the night of the Yuletide party. 2 years since a soft-spoken little girl in a plaid skirt and Big Bird sweater vanished beneath blinking Christmas lights. 2 years since her mother, Tammy Brannon, turned around and found her child was no longer by her side. Now, finally, they were in court. Fairfax County v. Caleb Hughes. The charge: abduction with intent to defile. It was the strongest legal avenue prosecutors could pursue. Melissa's body had never been found, and in the state of Virginia, a murder charge required proof not only of death, but of where that death had occurred. Without a crime scene, without remains, without a confession, there was no path to murder. But there was still justice to seek. The prosecution knew they were wading into a difficult battle. They had no direct eyewitness, no forensic smoking gun. What they had was a tower of circumstantial evidence. But piece by piece, thread by thread, that tower had become something formidable. They began by laying the foundation. They showed the jury who Melissa was. Photos of a smiling 5-year-old girl. Footage of her singing Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer in her grandfather's living room. Her voice quiet, her cheeks flushed, her shyness evident. This was the child the world had lost. Not just a name in a file, a daughter, a soul. Tammy sat quietly in the courtroom, her face pale, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had waited years for this moment, but no verdict would ever bring Melissa back. All she wanted was the truth to be seen, for people to understand what happened that night, for someone to finally say out loud what she had known since the moment she saw that open window. Melissa was taken. The prosecution brought in the residents who had seen Hughes at the party, sober at first, then drinking heavily. One woman described how he boasted about getting drunk. Another recalled him asking to run errands with a female manager in a way that made her deeply uncomfortable. His comments were crude, his gaze unsettling. Several partygoers remembered how much time he spent interacting with the children, especially Melissa. Witnesses spoke of his 30-minute stay at Tammy's table, the cupcake he gave to Melissa, the way he lingered even when others had moved on. Others testified about his behavior in the hallway near the bathrooms, how he offered to escort other children to the restroom, how he was seen exiting the men's bathroom just as a group of kids walked by. Each account added another layer to the profile. He had opportunity, he had access, he had familiarity with the layout, and he had a motive that simmered just beneath the surface. The prosecution turned to the evidence. They presented the shoes, Hughes's white Nikes, pulled warm from the dryer that night. They showed the jury how chunks had been cut from the soles, how luminol tests revealed traces of blood even after washing. They displayed the laundry timeline, how Hughes came home at 12:30 a.m., immediately showered, and rushed to clean everything he had worn, including his shoes. They presented the odometer reading, how 51 extra miles had been logged between the time he left the party and the time he arrived home. They walked the jury through the geography. Melissa was last seen at 10 p.m. Hughes claimed to have left shortly after, and yet he didn't get home until after midnight. His wife remembered the time clearly, 12:20 a.m. She remembered the frustration, the confusion, the banging sound of sneakers in the dryer. She remembered how he didn't even mention the missing child until after he'd showered and laundered his clothes. Then came the fibers. The scientists from Quantico took the stand. They spoke calmly, methodically, guiding the jury through their findings. They explained the taping method, the analysis of each thread, the comparison process. They held up the duplicate J.C. Penney outfit, explaining how it had been chemically matched to the fibers found in Hughes's car. Red threads from the plaid skirt, blue patches from the sweater elbows, yellow fuzz from Big Bird's image, and among them, rabbit fur. Not just any rabbit fur, Tammy's rabbit fur coat, the same one she had worn to the party, the same one Melissa had pressed against when she hugged her mother. The fibers were intertwined, Melissa's outfit and Tammy's coat, tangled together and deposited in the front passenger seat of Caleb Hughes's car. It wasn't theoretical, it was physical. And then came the hair. A brown strand found in Hughes's vehicle was compared against hairs from Melissa's hairbrush. It was her hair, her actual DNA, her presence in his car. The prosecution turned to motive. Why intent to defile? Why not simply abduction? Because of what Hughes did afterward. Because of the excessive fibers found in the passenger seat, which indicated that Melissa's jacket had likely been removed. Because of the signs of a possible struggle. Because Hughes had cut up his shoes, likely to destroy evidence of bodily fluids. Because he had driven 51 miles, unaccounted for. Because he had come home and immediately erased every trace of what had happened. Because Melissa never returned. The defense pushed back hard. They argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that there were no witnesses to Hughes committing any crime, that the fibers could have transferred another way, that Melissa could have brushed against his clothing at the party, that his shoes were simply old and worn, not deliberately altered. They insisted that nothing directly tied Hughes to a crime, only a theory, only suspicion. But theories don't leave hair in cars. Suspicion doesn't cut up shoes, and the truth doesn't hide behind silence. After 8 days of testimony, the jury was sent to deliberate. 9 hours passed. 9 long hours. Tammy sat in the courthouse hallway, surrounded by silence. The courthouse lights buzzed faintly above her. Every step in the corridor echoed like a countdown. And then the door opened. The jury had reached a verdict. Guilty. Caleb Hughes was found guilty of abduction with intent to defile. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison. 15 years for taking a child, for destroying a life. On top of that, he would also serve 4 years for violating his parole from a previous conviction. 19 years in total. It wasn't enough. It wasn't close to enough. But it was something. It was a name on a record. It was accountability. And it was, for Tammy, the first breath of justice she had taken in 2 long years. But the story wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The courtroom was quiet when the verdict was read, but the silence carried weight. Tammy Brannan sat still, tears pressing against her eyes, her breathing shallow. The word guilty echoed through her chest, not with triumph, but with the dull ache of what it couldn't change. Melissa was still gone. There was no body to bury, no grave to visit, no final answer to the question that had haunted her every day for the past 2 years. Where is my daughter? Caleb Hughes had been sentenced to 15 years for abduction with intent to defile, plus 4 additional years for a prior parole violation. 19 years in total. To many, it sounded like justice. But for Tammy, it was a clock that would one day run out. A door that might open again. And behind it, a man who still had never said where he took her child. Tammy returned home from court to a quiet apartment. The Christmas tree was gone now, long since removed. But the space where it had stood still felt sacred, as though invisible branches held tightly to the gifts Melissa never opened. Tammy had kept them all, untouched, wrapped, waiting. People told her to move on. But how do you move on when your child is still missing? She refused to change her phone number. Melissa had memorized it. If there was even the slimmest chance her daughter was alive somewhere, if she had been taken and somehow escaped, Tammy wanted that number to be waiting, like a lighthouse left on through every storm. The Woodside apartments grew quieter in the months that followed the trial. Residents came and went. Some moved out to escape the memory of that December night. Others stayed, but with changed hearts, locking windows that once were left open, watching their children with a different kind of vigilance. Tammy, though, had already left. She couldn't live where Melissa had been taken. The echoes of that hallway, the sight of the clubhouse, the window, the fence, it was too much. But she carried the memory with her, always. She tried to build a new life. She got married again. She had more children. And yet there was a place inside her that would never fully heal. "I have stepkids," she said in an interview years later. "But I have this empty place that's never going to go away." Every year on the anniversary of Melissa's disappearance, Tammy released a balloon into the sky. On it, she wrote a message. Simple, heartfelt words she hoped might travel further than she ever could. "Come home, Melissa, I'm still waiting." She never stopped believing that someone, somewhere, knew the truth. And for a long time, that truth lay buried behind prison walls. Caleb Hughes had served his sentence in silence. He never confessed, never offered a location, never showed remorse. But even from prison, his past followed him. Tammy feared what might happen when his time ran out. And then, the system failed her again. In 1991, Virginia law allowed for early release based on good behavior. At the time, it was a common practice, intended to encourage discipline inside correctional facilities. Hughes, who had kept his head down in prison, earned good conduct credits year after year. He was denied parole in 2017, again in 2018. But under the law, denial didn't matter. By 2019, he had earned so many good behavior credits that the Department of Corrections was required, by law, to release him. On August 2nd, 2019, Caleb Hughes walked out of prison. He had served just 29 years of his 54-year sentence, and he never said a word about what happened to Melissa Brannon. Tammy learned of his release from a press call. Her hands shook as she read the date. She had known it was coming, had watched the calendar creep forward like a slow tide. But the reality of it still hit like a wave. The man who had taken her child, the man she knew in her heart was responsible for her daughter's disappearance, was free. She feared for other children, for other families. She knew what he was capable of. She had lived with the consequences. The public outcry was swift. How could this happen, people asked. The answer was simple. The law had changed, but Hughes had been sentenced before the change. And under the rules of 1991, his release was mandatory. Even the parole board had objected, twice. But their vote no longer mattered. And so, Hughes settled into a quiet life in Rocky Mount, Virginia. He was in his early 50s now, his hair thinner, his face more weathered. But the danger hadn't aged out of him. He told his new neighbors that he was a veteran, that his wife had died of cancer, that he had moved to escape painful memories. He was quiet, friendly, a man who seemed to live simply and without trouble. He offered to babysit, and parents, unaware of his past, let him. He watched a 9-year-old boy, a 5-year-old girl, sat with them in pools, played games, smiled, and no one knew who he really was, until one parent did. Curious, cautious, and protective, the father pulled up the state's sex offender registry. There was his face, Caleb Daniel Hughes, convicted of abducting a 5-year-old girl in 1989. The police were called immediately. The quiet illusion shattered. Hughes had violated one of the strictest conditions of his parole: no contact with anyone under the age of 18. On May 31st, 2024, Caleb Hughes was arrested again, this time for violating the terms of his sex offender status. He was sentenced to 15 more years in prison. The justice system had missed him once, but this time it caught up. Tammy was contacted after the arrest. Her voice in a phone interview was tired, but steady. "I don't know what happened to those children," she said, "but I know that at a minimum, they were placed in danger. And it's extremely upsetting to me that he was given the opportunity to do that again." She had tried to tell them. She'd warned everyone, and still, the law had allowed him to walk free. It was a cruel truth, but it was not the end of the story. Not yet. Years pass differently when you're grieving. For Tammy Brannon, time had never moved forward. It had only widened the distance between her and her daughter. Every December came like a fresh wound, every snowfall carrying with it the echo of a missing laugh, a missing hand to hold. People said time healed, but for Tammy, time only deepened the silence. Even as the world moved on, new stories filled the news. New faces filled the neighborhood. New generations grew up never knowing what had happened on that cold December night in 1989. The Yuletide party at the Woodside Apartments became a memory few talked about, buried in the snow, like a secret people hoped would stay there. But not Tammy. She never forgot. She never stopped hoping that someone, somewhere, might say something. Because there was still no grave. Still no place to visit. Still no answer to the question that haunted her every morning. Where is Melissa? Even after Caleb Hughes was convicted, Tammy's pain remained unresolved. He had been found guilty of abducting her daughter. He had been sentenced, but he had never confessed. He had never told her where Melissa was. That silence. That was the second crime. For years, Tammy did what she could to hold on. She kept Melissa's belongings, her toys, her drawings, her favorite blanket. She refused to take her photos off the walls. She never changed the phone number Melissa had memorized, hoping, always hoping, that if by some miracle her daughter was alive, she would know how to find her way home. She remarried, had stepchildren, rebuilt a life, but always with that empty place inside her. And every year on the anniversary of Melissa's disappearance, she released a balloon into the sky. A message tied to a string, a hope carried on the wind. In 1999, the 10-year anniversary of Melissa's disappearance arrived. A local reporter interviewed Tammy. She was quiet, measured, but still holding on. "I'm happily married," she said. "I have stepkids, but I have this empty place that's never going to go away." She spoke of the gifts still wrapped under the bed, of the black rabbit fur coat she kept, worn and soft from years of memory, of the balloon she would release again, still writing her daughter's name, still believing. The case had become one of the most well-known child abduction cases in Virginia history, and yet, despite national coverage, despite FBI involvement, despite forensic breakthroughs, Melissa's body had never been found. There were theories that Hughes had driven Melissa toward the Potomac River, that he had disposed of her in a place no one would think to look, that the 51 unaccounted-for miles on his odometer were the silent trail of something final. But no proof had ever emerged. No trace of her ever surfaced. And so Tammy lived with the hardest burden of all, not knowing. Not knowing what Melissa's final moments were like. Not knowing where she rested. Not knowing if someone else might have been involved. Not knowing if she would ever truly get to say goodbye. And then, in 2019, came the release. Hughes had served 29 years. With good behavior credits, he walked free. No confession, no apology. Just a man stepping back into a world that had changed. Tammy was devastated. But what followed in 2024 brought something else. An unspoken validation. Hughes was arrested again for violating his parole by babysitting children in Rocky Mount. He had slipped into a new life, lied about his past, and offered to care for children, just as he had tried to insert himself into the lives of others on that fateful night in 1989. He had said he loved kids. He had watched a 5-year-old girl, Another child the same age Melissa had been. It wasn't just disturbing, it was clarifying. It confirmed what Tammy had always known, that Hughes was a predator, that Melissa hadn't just wandered off, that it wasn't random. It had been targeted, planned, executed with silence and cruelty. Tammy was contacted again after his arrest. She responded, not with relief, but with concern. "I don't know the extent of what may have happened to those children," she said. "But those children at a minimum were placed in danger. And it was just extremely upsetting to me that he would be given the opportunity to do that again. The law had failed to protect them once. She hoped it wouldn't fail again." Hughes was sentenced to 15 more years, set to be released in 2039. He will be in his late 60s, and once again Tammy waits. Not just for justice, but for truth. The kind of truth that can only come from one person. The one person who still refuses to speak. Caleb Hughes has never told authorities where he took Melissa Brannon. Never told Tammy what happened after her daughter walked toward that plate of chips. Never explained the 51 miles, the cut shoes, the rabbit hair, the blood. He simply walked out of that party and disappeared into the night. And for decades, the only trace of Melissa was the silence he left behind. The details are few, but they are burned into memory. The image is clear because it never had the chance to fade. Melissa Brannon, 5 years old, 3 feet tall, 38 pounds, was wearing a plaid skirt with red stockings, a navy sweater with big birds stitched on the corner, and little black shoes with gold buckles. It was December 3rd, 1989, a Sunday. She had been excited for the Christmas party. Her big blue eyes had widened in joy when her mother, Tammy, finally agreed to go. They had walked into the Woodside Apartments clubhouse hand in hand, just past 7:15 p.m., the holiday lights glowing gently outside. At first, Melissa clung to Tammy, shy as always. The crowd had been overwhelming. Roughly 115 people filled the room. Families mingled, children ran and played, and Santa was taking photos in the corner. Tammy held her daughter on her lap for nearly an hour. Melissa played with Tammy's hair, buried her face in her coat, occasionally peeked out and watched the room. Slowly, cautiously, she began to warm up. A little later, she saw 2 boys she had played with before. She asked Tammy if she could go say hi. Tammy nodded, and Melissa jumped down from her mother's lap and ran off toward the payphone in the hallway, where the kids were pretending to call their moms. It was innocent. It was joyful. It was normal. Every time Melissa wanted to do something new, talk to someone, use the bathroom, play a game, she returned to ask Tammy for permission. Always. She never wandered. She never strayed. That's what made what happened next impossible to accept. At around 10 p.m., the party was winding down. Tammy told Melissa they'd be leaving soon. Work was coming early the next morning. It was a Sunday night. Melissa nodded. She didn't protest. But then she remembered the chips. She asked her mom if she could take some potato chips home. Tammy smiled. Okay, but not too many. She watched her daughter walk toward the food table holding a green plate. She picked up a few chips, added a dollop of dip. Then she turned and walked back toward Tammy, down a small ramp that led toward the exit. At some point in those seconds, unseen, unnoticed, Caleb Hughes walked in her path. Tammy remembered watching her daughter spot her through the crowd. They locked eyes, and they smiled at each other. It was their last moment. Melissa was just a few feet away. Tammy turned, stamped out her cigarette, reached for her fur coat. She turned to say goodnight to the group of residents she had been speaking with, some neighbors, familiar faces. She slipped the coat over her shoulders, turned back around, and Melissa was gone. She didn't panic at first. She walked around the clubhouse expecting to see her daughter chatting with one of the boys again, or maybe grabbing a napkin. But the more she searched, the quieter the party became. People were leaving, and Melissa was nowhere. Tammy called her name, once, twice, then louder. People began to look. Parents questioned their own children. Did you see Melissa, the girl in the red skirt? No one had. Within minutes, panic swallowed the room. The manager called the police. The clubhouse was searched top to bottom. Tammy checked the bathrooms. Empty. Then she noticed a door marked private. It led to the utility room. She pushed it open. And there, across the room, was a full-length window. Open. The blinds raised. Cold air drifting in. Curtains fluttering. Her body went numb. She knew instantly. This wasn't a game of hide and seek. This wasn't a shy child falling asleep in a corner. Melissa had been taken, and she had been taken fast. The police arrived quickly, then more. K-9 units, military search teams, detectives. Every hallway was cleared. The window was photographed. Outside, fresh footprints led through the grass. They crossed a small area toward a split-rail fence. The top rail was broken. The prints continued on the other side. They led toward the parking lot of an old, abandoned restaurant. A car might have waited there, away from the complex, away from the party, away from anyone who could see. There were no child footprints, no signs that Melissa had walked. She had been carried, likely over the fence, likely to the waiting car, and then nothing. Gone. From a party full of people, from a room of neighbors, from under the soft glow of Christmas lights. The opportunity had been brief, just seconds. A cigarette stubbed out, a coat slipped on, a smile shared, and then emptiness. Tammy would replay that moment in her mind for years, again and again. The last time she saw her daughter, the small plate of chips, the smile, and then the space where she had been. No scream, no warning, just absence. It was the moment her life split in two, before and after. Some names never fade. They echo through time not because of who the person was, but because of what was taken from them and what they left behind. Melissa Brannon became one of those names. 5 years old, disappeared without a sound. Her image frozen forever. Plaid skirt, navy sweater, red stockings, wide blue eyes full of innocence. She should have grown up. Should have had her first sleepover, her first heartbreak, her first car, her own child perhaps by now. Instead, Melissa became a memory, but not a forgotten one. Tammy Brannon refused to let that happen. The gifts remained wrapped, the coat stayed in her closet. And every year, a balloon still found its way to the clouds with a message tied beneath it, always in Melissa's name. As the years passed, the world changed. Forensic science advanced. Missing persons databases became more connected. DNA testing became more refined. And yet in all that time, Melissa's body was never recovered. Not a bone, not a fragment of clothing, nothing. The fibers, the hairs, the miles on the odometer, the blood on the shoes, they told the story. But there was no final page, no closure. In the years following Hughes's conviction, Melissa's case became a teaching point in law enforcement and forensic circles. Her story was featured in documentaries, crime analysis programs, and child safety campaigns. She became a symbol, not just of tragedy, but of the importance of thorough investigation. Quantico scientists often referenced her case when speaking about the significance of fiber and trace evidence. The detailed work, matching Tammy's rabbit fur coat, identifying retail fiber sources, isolating Melissa's hair, showed how even the smallest clues could lead to justice, even without a confession. But no lecture or case study could ever capture what the loss had done to Tammy. She'd gone quiet in public. Rare interviews, no public breakdowns. She carried her grief inward. She remarried, built a life with stepchildren, but she never replaced Melissa. She couldn't. The hole Melissa left wasn't one that could be filled. It became a room in Tammy's heart with no door, no exit, just stillness. A place she visited every time a child giggled, every time a little girl passed in plaid, every Christmas morning. Melissa would have been 40 years old now. Tammy thinks about that sometimes. Would she have been a teacher? A mother? Would she still be shy? Would she still like Big Bird? No one knows, because one man never told. Caleb Hughes was the only person alive who knew what happened that night. He had the answers, and he kept them. He served his time, walked free, changed towns, lied to his neighbors, re-entered a world that had largely forgotten his name. But Melissa's mother hadn't, and neither had a few others. When Hughes was arrested again in 2024 for violating his parole, babysitting young children, there was no celebration, just fear, confirmation, validation, that this man, even 30 years later, had not changed. Tammy spoke softly to reporters after his rearrest. Her voice wasn't bitter, but it was tired, weighted by time. "I don't know what happened to those children," she said of the ones Hughes had watched. "But they were placed in danger, and it was just extremely upsetting that he was given the opportunity to do that again." She never said his name. She never needed to. Everyone knew who she meant. The man who stole her daughter. The man who took her child's voice and replaced it with silence. But Melissa's story never stayed silent. She lived on through child protection laws, through school safety protocols, through national media and forensic training materials. Her case helped shape how abductions were investigated in Virginia and beyond. Every fingerprint kit sent home with school children. Every locked utility door in an apartment complex. Every party with check-in procedures and background-verified staff. Melissa Brannon was there. Her absence reminded the world to pay attention, to never assume safety, to never look away. Even as the world forgot her name, the consequences of her story remained. Tammy still lives quietly. She's not an activist, not a speaker. She doesn't appear on television or attend crime conferences, but she remembers. She releases her balloon. She keeps her number the same. She wears the necklace Melissa once played with on her lap at the party. And every so often she visits the old clubhouse, now repainted, its windows changed, its halls filled with new tenants who have no idea what happened there. She walks past slowly, quietly, looking at the place where her daughter smiled at her for the last time. It's been decades, but that moment never left. Not for her. And not for those who have carried Melissa's name in their hearts all these years. Because names like hers, they don't fade. They whisper, they wait. They remind us what was lost, and what must never be allowed to happen again. In the aftermath of Melissa Brannon's disappearance, the case quickly became national news. Her photo, a home video of her singing Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, and the story of how she vanished from a Christmas party with over 100 people present made headlines across the country. The public responded strongly. Movie theaters began playing Melissa's home video during previews, followed by missing child announcements. A $75,000 reward was offered for any information. Tammy Brannon received overwhelming support from the public. She said the kindness she experienced gave her hope that Melissa would return alive. She refused to remove Melissa's wrapped presents from under the Christmas tree. Despite extensive searches by over 500 volunteers, military personnel from Fort Belvoir, and Fairfax County Police, nothing was found. Authorities also involved the FBI and experts from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children to support the investigation. While physical searches continued, the forensic process progressed. Melissa had been wearing a navy sweater with Big Bird, a matching plaid skirt, red stockings, and black shoes with gold buckles. Technicians used sticky tape methods to recover fibers and debris from Caleb Hughes's maroon Honda. Red and blue fibers were found on the passenger seat, matching the outfit Melissa was wearing. There were also black rabbit hairs and a strand of brown hair. The FBI's lab at Quantico, known as the most advanced forensic facility at the time, received and examined the evidence. Scientists there determined that the rabbit hairs found in the car matched the dyed black rabbit fur of Tammy Brannon's coat, dyed with a German-manufactured dye that wasn't available in the US. The brown hair was compared to strands from Melissa's hairbrush and was confirmed as hers. Quantico's team sought out a replica of Melissa's outfit, which had been purchased from JCPenney. Although the outfit was out of production, JCPenney supplied a list of credit card purchasers. One family still had the outfit, and the FBI used it to compare fibers. The red, blue, and yellow threads matched those found in Hughes's car. Blood traces were also found. Using luminol, small amounts of blood were detected on the steering wheel, brake pedal, and floor mat of Hughes's car, all on the driver's side. Luminol was also used on Hughes's shoes, revealing possible blood transfer. The white Nike sneakers collected from his dryer had sections cut from the soles. The newly exposed white portions showed signs of tampering. Investigators believed Hughes had cut out potentially stained areas. Melissa's blood may have been on them, but the luminol likely degraded any DNA evidence. The sneakers, hair, and fiber findings made up the core of the case. Due to the dye used in the rabbit fur and the interweaving of Melissa's clothing fibers and her mother's coat fibers, investigators were able to show that the passenger seat of Caleb Hughes's car contained a physical trace of Melissa. All of this pointed to her presence in that vehicle. With no confession and no body, this trace evidence was the prosecution's strongest weapon. To support their findings, FBI scientists at Quantico ran 8,000 fiber comparisons. Out of more than 100 pieces of navy blue clothing, only the duplicate JCPenney outfit matched the fibers found in Hughes's car. Melissa's case became a model for how trace evidence could be used in the absence of a body or eyewitness testimony. 1 year after Melissa Brannan's disappearance, a grand jury indicted Caleb Hughes for abduction with intent to defile. It was the strongest charge they could bring. In Virginia, prosecutors can charge murder without a body, but they must prove where the murder happened. Without Melissa's remains or a confirmed scene, that charge wasn't possible. At trial, the prosecution presented witness testimonies about Hughes's behavior during the party, how he made inappropriate remarks, how he offered to take children to the bathroom, how he interacted with Melissa and other kids, and how he commented on Melissa being pretty. They detailed his actions after the party, leaving around 10 p.m., driving 51 unaccounted for miles, getting home at 12:30 a.m., showering, and immediately washing his clothes and shoes. The FBI forensic analysts testified that Melissa's fibers, hair, and rabbit fur from Tammy's coat were all found in Hughes's car, specifically on the passenger seat. The prosecution argued that Melissa had to have been in that vehicle, and that based on the amount and placement of fibers, her jacket had been removed, suggesting inappropriate intent. The defense argued the evidence was circumstantial and described the case as a witch hunt. After an 8-day trial and 9 hours of jury deliberation, Hughes was found guilty. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison for abduction with intent to defile, plus 4 years for a parole violation. At the time, a 19-year sentence for a 23-year-old was considered significant. Under Virginia law in 1991, inmates could receive automatic sentence reductions for good behavior. This law was later abolished. Despite being denied parole in 2017 and again in 2018, Hughes was released on August 2, 2019 due to accumulated good conduct credits. After his release, Hughes moved to Rocky Mount, Virginia. He told people he was a veteran and that his wife had died of cancer. He offered to babysit for neighbors, and he was trusted to watch children, including a 9-year-old boy and a 5-year-old girl. One of the fathers eventually searched the local sex offender registry and found Hughes's name. Authorities were called. Hughes was arrested on May 31, 2024, for violating the conditions of his release, specifically for having contact with minors. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Tammy Brannan was contacted by news outlets for comment. She said, "I don't know the extent of what may have happened to those children, but those children at a minimum were placed in danger. And it was just extremely upsetting to me that he would be given the opportunity to do that again." Tammy never believed Hughes should have been released in the first place. She told reporters that although she had moved on with her life, remarried and raising stepchildren, she still carried a deep void. "I'm happily married, I have stepkids, but I have this empty place that's never going to go away. Tammy had never changed her phone number, believing Melissa may still remember it. Every year, she released a balloon into the sky with a message for her daughter. Melissa Brannon would have been 40 years old. After Caleb Hughes was arrested again in 2024, the community in Rocky Mount was shocked. Parents had trusted him. He had been alone with their children, babysitting, swimming with them, taking pictures. Once his history was revealed, the truth came out. He was a convicted sex offender, the prime suspect in the 1989 disappearance of Melissa Brannon. The law had failed to protect those children from exposure to danger. Despite being denied parole twice, Hughes had been released early due to a law that had since been abolished, but not retroactively. Once free, he reinvented himself under a false story and gained access to children again. The media reported that he had served only 29 years of his 54-year sentence. His rearrest came after parents discovered his name on the sex offender registry. Tammy Brannon responded by saying it was extremely upsetting that Hughes had been given the opportunity to do it again. She reiterated that although she couldn't prove it, she believed he hurt her daughter. Law enforcement confirmed Hughes had violated the terms of his release and was sentenced to serve 15 additional years, with a projected release in 2039. Tammy never stopped hoping for answers. She told reporters she had kept Melissa's belongings and that the presents she had wrapped in 1989 remained unopened. She also revealed that she paid to keep her phone number the same, the one Melissa had memorized. Each year on the anniversary of her daughter's disappearance, she released a balloon with a message written on it. Melissa Brannon would have been 40 years old. She might have had a 5-year-old of her own, but Caleb Hughes took that away. Her story ends, but another begins. Don't close your eyes just yet. Up next, we're stepping into a second case. Different people, a different place, but just as tragic. If you're still with us, settle in, and let's begin the next story. This is the story of Elizabeth Smart, a 14-year-old girl taken from her bedroom in the quiet hours before dawn. It was June 4th, 2002, a warm Tuesday night in Salt Lake City, Utah. Inside the Smart household, the lights were off. The family of 8 had gone to bed, the sounds of a regular evening still lingering in the silence. Elizabeth and her younger sister, Mary Catherine, had curled up under their blankets in the room they shared. They had spent the evening reading Ella Enchanted, taking turns with the book as they drifted into sleep. Their home was nestled in a safe neighborhood, a place where families prayed together, knew each other, and trusted that their doors could stay unlocked. But safety, like stillness, can be deceiving. That night, Elizabeth's mother, Lois, had burned a pot of potatoes while cooking dinner. Wanting to air out the smell, she cracked open a kitchen window. Later, in the rush of bedtime, she forgot to close it. It would become the smallest mistake with the deepest consequences. Sometime in the early morning hours, Elizabeth felt something cold press against her neck. She opened her eyes to see a man, his face hidden in shadows, his voice low and sharp. A knife was pressed against her skin. He told her to get up, that if she made a sound, if she tried to run, he would kill her entire family. Elizabeth's heart pounded. She could feel her 9-year-old sister still asleep beside her. Any noise, any struggle, and Mary Catherine might wake. And then what? So Elizabeth obeyed. She stepped quietly out of bed, bare feet touching the floor. The man led her from the room, out through the hallway, and down the stairs. He moved quickly and with purpose, as if he had done this before. They passed through the open kitchen window, the one Lois had forgotten to close. Outside, the world was dark and quiet. Elizabeth didn't scream. She didn't fight. The man held her tightly and vanished with her into the night. And just like that, she was gone. It was still dark when Mary Catherine opened her eyes. For a moment, everything felt normal, but then she noticed something was missing. She reached across the bed, expecting to feel her sister next to her. Instead, there was nothing but cold space and rumpled blankets. She sat up. The house was silent. Her heart beat faster as she stared into the shadows of their room. Then she remembered. The whisper, the knife, the man. She had woken up when it happened. Part of her had known it wasn't a dream, but fear had held her frozen. She never saw his face, just his silhouette standing over Elizabeth and then leading her away. Mary Catherine didn't move for hours. She stayed in bed, paralyzed by fear and uncertainty. When the sky finally began to lighten, she gathered her courage and ran to her parents' room. "Elizabeth's gone," she said. At first, Lois and Ed Smart thought the girls had just fought, or that Elizabeth had gone to sleep somewhere else in the house. But when they checked the rooms, when they saw the open window in the kitchen and the screen that had been cut, the truth hit them hard. She hadn't left. She had been taken. They called the police immediately. Within minutes, officers arrived and began searching the home. It was around 4 a.m. by then, several hours after Elizabeth had been abducted. The scent trail was already cold, and no one outside the family had seen or heard anything unusual that night. Mary Catherine tried to describe what little she remembered. A man, a knife, a voice, that was all. And yet, from this thin thread, a massive investigation began. By sunrise, the Smart household had transformed from a quiet family home into the center of a full-scale investigation. Police marked off the yard, news cameras gathered near the sidewalks, and neighbors stood in stunned silence, trying to understand how something so unthinkable could happen so close to home. Elizabeth Smart had vanished into the night. There were no signs of forced entry except the cut screen. No ransom note, no evidence, just the quiet testimony of her younger sister, trembling but determined, who remembered a voice. And over time, that memory would become the key. At first, investigators cast a wide net. The Smarts were known in their community, not famous but respected. Ed and Lois were devoted parents, active in their church, and generous to those in need. They had 6 children, a happy home. And like many Latter-day Saint families in Utah, they believed in service and kindness. Sometimes that kindness came in the form of charity. Months before Elizabeth was taken, the Smarts had hired a man off the street to help with odd jobs around the house. He was homeless, quiet, and seemed grateful for the opportunity. He worked hard, mostly yard work and light repairs, and he introduced himself as Emmanuel. No one knew his real name. No one asked. He disappeared not long after completing his work, and the family thought little of it. But now, with their daughter missing, everything came under new light. It would be months before Mary Catherine connected the voice she heard that night to the one she'd heard during Emmanuel's brief time around their home. But that connection, though it would come later, would crack the case open. For now, investigators looked elsewhere. At other workers the family had hired, at friends, at neighbors, at a man named Richard Ricci, who would come under intense scrutiny, though he had nothing to do with the abduction. And all the while, the real abductor, Emmanuel, whose real name was Brian David Mitchell, was hiding just miles away, in the mountains, in a homemade camp, with Elizabeth. Elizabeth didn't know where she was headed as Brian David Mitchell led her up the mountain behind her home. He moved swiftly through the dark trees, the path steep and rocky. She stumbled and tripped, her bare feet scraping against stones and roots, but he did not slow his pace. After what felt like hours, they reached a hidden clearing deep in the woods. There, among tarps and makeshift supports, stood a small camp. A single tent assembled from blankets and plastic sheeting, a rough table fashioned from scrap lumber, and little else. Inside the tent waited another figure, 57-year-old Wanda Barzee. Brian introduced her simply, his wife. Wanda wore a long robe and covered her hair, standing silently as Elizabeth was ushered into the small, dim space. Brian told Elizabeth she was chosen for a sacred purpose. He spoke of prophecy and destiny. Then he forced her to change into a white robe and veil, garments meant to mark her new, he said, spiritual role. On April 15, 2002, just over a week after her abduction, Elizabeth found herself in a ceremony she did not understand. As Brian recited his words, she realized they were binding her in ways she could not see. He led her outside, chained her ankle with a metal cable to the base of a nearby tree, and told her she could not leave. That night, he raped her. The man who had taken her from her bedroom now treated her as his wife and his captive. Elizabeth lay on the hard ground, the chain cutting into her ankle, the chill of the earth beneath her back. She cried herself to sleep, not sure when or if she would ever be free. Each morning, Brian returned with Wanda's quiet presence nearby. He reinforced the chain, reminding Elizabeth that she was now bound by his supposed divine will. He told her her family had forgotten her, that she must accept her new life. But Elizabeth did not give in. In the darkness of that camp, beneath the towering pines, she closed her eyes and held fast to one truth. Her parents would not stop looking for her. She clung to memories of home, to her mother's voice, to her sister's laugh. Every prayer she had ever learned she whispered into the night air, hoping her faith would guide rescuers to her. In that hidden camp, alone, chained, and afraid, Elizabeth made a silent vow. She would survive, no matter what, and she would find her way back home. 3 days had passed since Elizabeth vanished from her bed. Back home, her family was doing everything they could to bring her back. Her name was on flyers, on the news. Helicopters hovered over the hills. Police dogs searched the brush. Her parents, Ed and Lois, clung to hope. But the trail was cold, and in the forest, just a few miles away, Elizabeth was still chained to a tree. The camp was silent, except for the wind moving through pine needles. Then, she heard it. A voice, calling her name. It was her uncle. Elizabeth froze. Her heart pounded in her chest. She recognized that voice, familiar and close. He was near, closer than anyone had been in days. He was shouting for her, walking through the woods below. She turned toward the sound, but the chain held her back. Then came a sharp whisper beside her. Brian. He leaned in quickly, eyes full of threat. If you say anything, he hissed, I will kill them. I will kill your family. Elizabeth froze again. Her lips stayed shut. She didn't move. Her uncle's voice drifted further away, fainter with each call. And then, it was gone. She was still chained, still captive, still lost. Later, she would say that this moment haunted her. That rescue had been within reach, but fear had kept her silent. And yet, who could blame her? She was 14. She'd been taken from her bed. She was chained, starved, and threatened daily. And she believed him when he said he would hurt her family. So she stayed quiet, just as he wanted. For days after, she barely spoke. In the smart home, her parents continued searching. The media attention had grown nationwide. Tips flooded in, hundreds of leads, many useless, some dangerous. Police followed every name, every rumor. But the man they were looking for, Brian David Mitchell, wasn't on their radar. Not yet. And Elizabeth, still chained, still praying, waited for another voice to call her name, one that wouldn't disappear into the trees. While Elizabeth remained hidden in the mountains, chained, silenced, and waiting, the investigation was speeding forward, but not in the right direction. Back in Salt Lake City, the police believed they had a lead. His name was Richard Ritchie. He had once worked as a handyman for the Smart family, a man with a checkered past and a criminal record that included theft, burglary, and drug use. To investigators, He looked like the kind of person who might take a child. There was just one problem. He didn't, but that didn't stop the suspicion. The police focused their full attention on him. They questioned him, investigated his alibi, even arrested him, not for the kidnapping, but for stealing from homes in the neighborhood. They searched his house and his car. They tried to find a link to Elizabeth, but there wasn't one. Still, they leaned into it, hard. They believed that Richard Ricci was their best hope, their strongest suspect. All the while, Elizabeth's little sister, Mary Catherine, had been holding on to something. She had seen the kidnapper's face. That night, she'd been just 9 years old. She'd pretended to sleep, too afraid to move as the man with the knife took her sister. But she'd heard his voice, his footsteps. She remembered something about him, something specific, something that told her it wasn't Richard Ricci. She tried to tell them. They didn't listen. Instead, police continued to investigate Ricci. They put pressure on his wife. They looked for evidence in places there was none. And while they waited, Elizabeth remained in that camp in the woods, her ankle chained, her stomach empty, her heart full of hope someone would find her. Then, in early August 2002, Richard Ricci suffered a brain aneurysm in prison. He died shortly after, and just like that, their so-called best suspect was gone. With his death, the case fell into silence. No answers, no progress, no new leads. And somewhere in the mountains, Elizabeth realized no one was coming. At least, not yet. By the end of July 2002, nearly 2 months had passed since Elizabeth Smart was taken from her bed. The police were still chasing the wrong man. Richard Ricci was in custody. Elizabeth was still in chains. And Brian David Mitchell? He wasn't done. He had a new plan. A new girl. It started with a conversation in the camp, one of many strange, delusional monologues from Mitchell. He asked Elizabeth questions, casual at first, but then something caught her attention. He asked about her cousin, a 15-year-old girl. Elizabeth was terrified. She had mentioned her once, without thinking, trying to humanize herself, hoping maybe it would make Mitchell see her as a real person. Instead, he latched onto it. He decided the girl would be his next wife. Elizabeth begged him not to go through with it. But Mitchell, drunk on power and belief in his twisted mission, refused to listen. He told Elizabeth he had received a message from God, and that meant nothing would stop him. On July 24, 2002, he made his move. He left the camp in the middle of the night, wandered down the mountain, into Salt Lake City, to Elizabeth's family home, the very place he had taken her from. He crept through the yard like a shadow, found the house, went to a window, and just like before, he tried to cut the screen, but something went wrong. This time, someone inside the house heard the sound, woke up, moved, called out. Brian fled. By the time the family turned on the lights, he was gone. The police were called, and they came quickly, but it was too late. He'd vanished into the night. No one, not even Elizabeth's family, knew that the man who had just tried to break into their house was the same man who had taken Elizabeth. And Elizabeth? She knew something had gone wrong the moment he returned to the camp. She saw it in his face. He was frustrated, quiet. He said nothing to her for hours. And then he grew more controlling. Tighter chains, harsher threats, longer silences. Elizabeth's situation, already unimaginable, was becoming more dangerous by the day. But in Salt Lake City, the police still didn't see the connection. They logged the attempted break-in, filed the report, and moved on. They didn't know that the same man was planning his next move, again. It had been nearly 2 months since Elizabeth Smart was taken from her home. The days were long, the nights longer. The camp was still. Elizabeth survived. Barely. Her world had shrunk to trees, tarps, threats, and silence. No one had found her, and no one seemed to be getting closer. But back in Salt Lake City, something was stirring. And it came from someone small, Her name was Mary Catherine. She was just 10 years old. She'd seen her sister taken. She had heard the man's voice. She'd stayed quiet, frozen in bed, afraid he would come back. But she remembered. And one night, weeks after Elizabeth disappeared, Mary Catherine was flipping through a Guinness Book of World Records. Just a distraction, something to take her mind off everything. Then she saw it. A face, a photo of a woman, someone who reminded her of someone else. Suddenly it clicked. She jumped up, ran to her parents. She said, "It wasn't Richard Ricci." The man who took Elizabeth, his voice, his presence. It wasn't the man police were focused on. She remembered who it sounded like. A man named Emmanuel. The Smart family had once hired him off the street to help with odd jobs around the house. He worked in the yard, talked about God, called himself Emmanuel. He wore long robes and acted strange, but he seemed harmless at the time. Now, Mary Catherine was sure it had been him. Her parents, Ed and Lois, were stunned. This was the first real lead. A new direction after weeks of dead ends. They told the police, but the response? Slow. The authorities were skeptical. Emmanuel had no last name, no traceable record, just a memory and a nickname. And besides, they were still invested in the Richard Ricci theory, even though Ricci was now dead. For a while, the sketch stayed buried in a file. The one person who had been closest to the abduction was telling them it wasn't the man they thought, and no one was listening. So the Smarts waited, until one day they decided waiting wasn't enough. It was February 3rd, 2003. Now 8 months since Elizabeth Smart vanished. 8 months of silence, of hope and heartbreak, of watching tips dry up and headlines fade. But that morning, Elizabeth's parents, Ed and Lois Smart, did something bold. They held a press conference. Standing before cameras in Salt Lake City, surrounded by microphones and questions, they released something the police had refused to make public. A composite sketch of a man named Emmanuel. The same Emmanuel their daughter Mary Catherine had remembered. The same man the police had been ignoring. Lois held up the drawing, short, wavy hair, long features, light, haunting eyes. He looked quiet, plain, unassuming. But behind that ordinary face, they believed, was the man who had taken Elizabeth. They told the world, "This is who we believe took our daughter. If you recognize him, we beg you, please come forward." Within days, the sketch aired on national news. It made its way to America's Most Wanted. The image spread like wildfire, and then something happened. People started calling in. One caller was Brian David Mitchell's own sister. She recognized the sketch. Another was his stepson. He knew that face too. Suddenly, Emmanuel had a real name. Brian David Mitchell. He was 49 years old, a street preacher, a self-proclaimed prophet. He'd been living homeless, wandering cities, quoting scripture, convincing strangers he was God's messenger. He'd once been hired by Ed Smart to help with roofing and yard work, and now all eyes were on him. More tips came in. Police released photos of Mitchell to the public, real ones this time. His face was everywhere, on TV, online, in newspapers, on flyers. Now the world knew who to look for, but they didn't know where he was, because by that time, Brian David Mitchell and Elizabeth were hundreds of miles away in San Diego, and they were about to come back. By late February 2003, the world knew his name, Brian David Mitchell. They knew his face, they knew he was dangerous, and they knew he had Elizabeth Smart. But Mitchell didn't know any of that. He was living off the grid, in the woods, in shadows, with Elizabeth and Wanda Barzee beside him. For months, they had moved through San Diego, pitching tents in dry riverbeds and wooded lots, drifting like ghosts. No one suspected a thing. Elizabeth was always covered, a gray wig, a veil, sunglasses, hidden in plain sight. She was so close to help, And yet, every time someone got near, she froze, too afraid to speak, too afraid he'd hurt her family. But then, in late February, something shifted. Mitchell said they were leaving California, heading east. Elizabeth panicked. If they went east, into the unknown, she might never be found again. But after 9 long months of captivity, she had learned how to play his game. So she made a move. Not a scream, not a run, just a suggestion. I feel like God is telling us to go back to Salt Lake City. She said it softly, carefully, speaking in the same scriptural language Mitchell used himself. He paused, prayed, and said yes. He believed her. He believed God had spoken. They packed what little they had: tarps, robes, scraps, and hitched rides north. 3 lost figures moving up the coast, unnoticed, until they reached Sandy, Utah, a small town just outside Salt Lake City. It was March 12th, 2003, and they were finally home. But something was different now. Mitchell seemed paranoid, jittery, as if a presence was creeping in behind him. That's when he made the mistake. He took Elizabeth and Wanda into Walmart. He thought he could disguise her again. Gray wig, sunglasses, robe. But this time, it didn't work. 2 different couples looked at him, looked again, whispered. Then they called the police. I think we just saw Brian Mitchell. March 12, 2003. The call came into the Sandy, Utah Police Department around midday. We think we saw him. Brian David Mitchell. He's outside Walmart. 2 women with him. One's wearing a gray wig and sunglasses. The dispatcher asked for details, took the description, sent a unit out. Just minutes later, squad cars arrived, quietly, cautiously. They found 3 people walking along State Street. 1 man, 2 women, just like the caller said. The man, tall, unkempt, robes flowing, fit the image plastered across wanted posters nationwide. The officers stepped out, approached slowly. One looked at the girl in the wig and sunglasses and robe. She didn't look up. She didn't say a word. But something in her face, something in her posture, said, "This is her." The officer turned to her gently. "What's your name?" Silence. The man, Mitchell, stepped in to speak, but the officers shut him down. They asked again, this time more firmly. "What's your name?" The girl whispered something, too soft to hear. They leaned closer. "It's okay," one officer said. "You're safe now." Then finally, just above a breath, she said, "Elizabeth. Elizabeth Smart." Everything froze. 9 months of searching, 9 months of nightmares, 9 months of hoping, praying, and fearing the worst. Elizabeth Smart was alive. They separated her from Mitchell and Wanda immediately. They took her to the Sandy police station, away from the crowds, away from the chaos. There, they called her father. Ed Smart picked up the phone. He was told, "We have Elizabeth. She's safe." He didn't believe it, not at first, but he raced to the station. When he saw her, really saw her, he broke, wrapped her in his arms. And for the first time in 9 months, Elizabeth cried, not from fear, not from pain, but from relief, from finally being free. Elizabeth Smart was home, but the story was far from over. The world rejoiced. A miracle, they said. A girl stolen in the night, thought to be gone forever, had survived 9 terrifying months. Her name was everywhere. Her face, once hidden behind sunglasses and scarves, was now lit with shy recognition and a quiet strength. But beneath that relief was trauma. And for Elizabeth, freedom came with noise. The noise of headlines, flashing cameras, and endless questions. Why didn't she scream? Why didn't she run? Was she brainwashed? The public wanted answers. But what they didn't understand was this. Elizabeth had been 13 when it happened, and she had been controlled, broken down, day by day, by a man who called himself a prophet, and a woman who stood by and watched. Inside the tent, chained to a tree, she had been told her family would be murdered if she ever tried to leave. Outside, even when given brief chances to escape, she was too afraid to try. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was survival. As the nation tried to process what had happened, the legal system moved into action. Brian David Mitchell and Wanda Barzee were both arrested and charged. But things didn't move quickly. Both Mitchell and Barzee claimed they were prophets, unfit to stand trial. They quoted scripture, mumbled in court, tried to delay proceedings by insisting they were divinely guided. For years, the case dragged on. Meanwhile, Elizabeth tried to rebuild. She returned to her family, finished high school. She learned how to live again, but she never forgot, and she never stayed silent. In 2009, Wanda Barzee pled guilty. She was sentenced to 15 years, but released early in 2018, a move that shocked the nation. Elizabeth, now grown, stood in front of cameras again. She will always be a threat to children, she said. Always. And as for Brian David Mitchell, it wasn't until 2010, 7 years after Elizabeth's rescue, that he finally stood trial. Elizabeth took the stand herself. She looked Mitchell in the eyes. She told the courtroom in calm, unwavering words about the rapes, the threats, the mental torment, and how he tried to erase her identity. But she was still here, still standing, still herself. The jury found him guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to life in federal prison, with no possibility of parole. Elizabeth Smart was free. Her kidnapper gone forever, locked away behind concrete and steel, where his voice would no longer reach her. But freedom doesn't always come quietly, and healing doesn't follow the calendar. Elizabeth tried to resume a normal life. But how do you define normal after spending 9 months chained to the ground? At first, she chose privacy. She didn't do interviews. She didn't explain. She didn't know anyone that. But over time, she began to speak, not for curiosity seekers, but for survivors. She shared her story to bring light into places where other voices were still trapped in darkness. In 2013, Elizabeth released her memoir, My Story. It was raw, powerful, and unflinching. She described the moment she was taken, the tent, the cold, the abuse. She wrote about how day by day she found her own ways to survive. And she wrote about what came next, not just recovery, but purpose. Elizabeth became an advocate for child safety and abuse prevention. She started the Elizabeth Smart Foundation, working with lawmakers, survivors, and families to protect children across the country. She spoke at schools. She lobbied for policy change. She never let what happened define her. What happened to me is part of my life, she said, but it does not determine who I am. In 2012, Elizabeth married Matthew Gilmore, a man from Scotland who she met while doing missionary work. They now have children of their own, a family, a home, peace. She's often asked how she survived. Her answer is simple. I chose to live. I chose to fight. I chose not to let him win. The story of Elizabeth Smart is more than a kidnapping. It's more than survival. It's about taking your voice back, even when someone tried to steal it. And even now, decades later, she remains a reminder that light can still rise after the darkest night. Thanks for listening to tonight's case. If you found it compelling, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with someone who loves true crime. And most importantly, tap the notification bell so you never miss a case. We drop a new story every single night, right here on True Crime Whispers Before Sleep.